has this. They can put up. Are you having anything you're going to show on here?
Nothing.
Just
They had said maybe they would put an image back there. I don't know. Oye, ¿dónde está? ¿Tienes esa imagen que quieres atrás o no? ¿Qué?
Por eso decidí que no.
Pero ¿por qué lo necesitamos entonces? Digamos imagen. Porque si no tenemos imagen, ¿por qué necesitamos pantalla?
You have your logo por los streaming.
Oh, pero ellos ven desde ahí, ¿no?
Sí.
Pero ¿por qué necesitamos esto? Okay. ¿Es necesario? No puede estar simplemente ahí.
We can turn the projector off if you need it.
Yeah, porque si no vamos a usar imágenes y el streaming puede pasar por ahí.
Okay.
Yeah, let's get stuff off. There's no image. Yeah, mejor, porque then I don't have to feel like a little version of me is walking back behind you, you know?
Yes. And you're already live, so.
Oh, really?
start. You have 6 years.
And it's plenty loud. We were watching the mic jump, so it picks up everything.
Is the mic like up here?
It's right here, sir.
But like if I move around,
It'll.
I kind of pace when I lecture. If I can stand still too, but
No,
it'll catch me.
it's a 25 to 50-foot mic.
Okay.
So it's gonna.
So this is one of those things where people get in trouble, like
Yes.
they think they're talking and then
Yes.
everybody back can hear
Yes,
it.
sir.
There was some scandal with that just the other day.
Yes, sir. It'll pick up your guys in the back when they start playing on their phone.
Okay.
Do you need anything else, sir?
But no, I wish you would have told me that. I hope I didn't say anything earlier.
We just.
So we just started.
I'm totally kidding.
Alright.
All right, thank you
Do
guys
you
for
want
your
me
help.
to leave a
That's
cell
really
phone in case there's a problem? Or?
cool. Sure. Actually, you know, the guy right there, he's kind of running all this. So if there's a problem, I'll look at him helplessly.
Show him how to stop this recording. Teams and myself, because I'm across the street. Say they have problems, he can call my cell and I'll be back in 5 minutes.
I'm gonna show you one thing. When this is all over, because it's recorded. When it's all over, click the black thing and just stop recording.
Here, the green one.
Click this. Stop
Okay.
recording and stop streaming. Okay? It's okay. I can take you here. So click on this. Click on this black thingy. Come here. Click on stop recording and stop streaming. And then just one more thing, come back here and then end. Okay? And after stop there, end. Okay? You got it? Yes. Okay, I'm gonna message you Scott's number. So if you have anything, just call it. Okay, thank you so much. Okay.
¿Vas a flacar? ¿Ya? ¿Cómo estás?
So, are you gonna put that?
No, I don't need to. Just the,
Not loud enough.
yeah.
Hello, my name's Jaime Aguila. I am a professor of history at Midland College. Many decades I taught here, and in fact, some of you will remember, not Antonio, when I first started teaching here, there's only one building, the Mesa building, and the library was 1/8 of the second floor. That many, anyway, so that's how old I am. So my name's Jaime Aguila. Antonio, Professor Moreno has invited me to introduce Joshua Lund here, who is the entertainment for the day, for the evening. So to give you a formal introduction, Professor Joshua Lund is professor at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Spanish and Romance Literature. There was confusion over that on our part, but
It's a confusing name.
it's a confusion of Romance languages and literature, primarily Spanish, obviously. He's written 3 books, one on Werner Herzog, the second book, Mestizo State, Reading Race in Modern Mexico, and the third book, The Impure Imagination Toward a Critical Hybridity in Latin American Writing. Now, I'd just like to make, Professor Moreno asked me to make a few comments about the idea of identity or mestizo. And I think for non-Hispanic Americans, especially non-Mexican Americans, this idea of identity becomes very difficult to understand. And when you're my age, and you've been to as many Christmases as I've been to, I don't understand the difficulty because it's so easy to explain. But it'd be like, so for me, I grew up Mexican, and I was Mexican American. I went to college. I was hardcore Chicano. I came home, said, "Dad, I'm a Chicano." My dad is a Mexican immigrant. He almost punched me. Said, "No, eres Mexicano." There's only one proper term when we're talking about identity for Hispanics, Hispanos, those of us of Latin American heritage. It's whatever you decide to call yourself. Identity is very personal. So what you choose, it's what's important. But at the same time, the idea of mestizo, mestizaje, which is the foundation for today's talk, which I'm looking forward to, it accepts diversity. It accepts that we are very different at every different level. Not within your soul, within your thinking, obviously what you look like, the language you speak, but it changes over the course of time. So for example, my father, who was very upset when I said I was a mestizo, my dad only speaks Spanish, even though he's taken a perpetual number of English classes, but he's always working. He has a friend that's younger than me that he worked with before my dad retired. And I saw my dad talking to him, and my dad's friend was speaking in English. And my father only speaks Spanish. And I asked him, "Papá, ¿quién es?" "Oh, es mi amigo Juan, es un Chicano." And it caught me, so for his friend, the Chicano, so Chicano for my father was no longer a negative term or negative concept, because my dad had evolved, but the idea of identity had changed, especially here in the United States. Chicano used to be a very popular term, very common term. Now we're interacting with terms like Latinx, Mexican X, Latina, Mexicana, Chicana, or whatever. If you don't understand what those mean, don't worry. Just accept the person's their choice for how they call themselves. Now, if you don't speak Spanish and you hear someone speaking Spanish, yes, we are talking about you. We're saying many bad things. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, Dr. Lund, it's all yours.
Hi, hola, ¿cómo están? So, I just changed my lecture like 5 minutes ago. Para que sepan. You're here for the lecture, right? Okay. Why are they all sitting like that? Like this is what people do. I thought it was like a norteño thing, because I'm from the north. Like you go to a lecture and like everybody like immediately like exaggerates 6 feet apart, you know? Like people sit like, and people especially sit like, I like this guy here, like strategically by the door, you know, because it's like, you never know when a lecture is going to get too long. So where that guy's sitting is exactly where I sit. But if you guys wanted to, you could move in. I'm not going to make it happen, but you could like take after this guy here, you could move in. We could just turn this into a cool conversation instead of some professor going on and on and on.
He's gonna throw his balls out.
What's that? So here we go, here's a lecture. Every nation, it's called The Mestizo State, A Deep Cultural History. Every nation produces an identity through which its natural history as a political formation is expressed. In European-derived societies, these national identities emerge through and in dialogue with racial discourse. Mexico is no exception to this rule. In fact, it is an archetypal case. Can you guys imagine? That's how my book started. That's how the book, The Mestizo State, started. Can you guys imagine if I just like went on like that for like 40 minutes? I saw a couple people over here like start to go like this already. No, in academia sometimes we talk like that, and I don't, what is this? These national identities emerge through and in dialogue with racial discourse. I don't know who I was trying to impress when I wrote that, but sometimes, in academia we talk in a way that's a little bit alienating. So I think what I'm going to do, instead of what I was originally thinking of doing, was to get into a little bit of the cultural history of this complicated idea of mestizaje, but specifically in Mexico. And it's quite a bit different than the way in which my colleague was speaking about it. And everything that he said was correct and eloquent and beautiful. Mestizaje is a little bit of a more fraught and complicated question in Mexico per se. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to say just a couple words, because the Mestizo State, which is the book what I'm talking about today, is based on, has its own history because it came out several years ago and has been in circulation since. So I'm going to say a couple of words about that project, which exists, and then if you're like, oh, that sounds interesting, or like, oh, wow, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and you want to tear it to shreds, you can go find it. It's really easy to find. And then I'll say a few words about kind of the deep history of the formation of the idea of mestizo, mestizaje in the Mexican context. And then I was going to go on this big thing about a kind of an anthropologist who I'm going to guess for most of you guys would be pretty obscure. He's super interesting, but I don't know that that's going to resonate, talking about a guy who was working 120 years ago, and even if he set a path for thinking about race in Mexico, my guess is that if you guys are interested in the stuff we talk about today, you'd be better off going to the book and looking at that stuff. So rather than get into this guy, Manuel Gami was his name, let me just say a couple words about the book, what it's about, and I'll hit you guys with some of the history from it, and then we can talk if people want to discuss. So the Mestizo State, here's what the Mestizo State is. The Mestizo State is a book that is about the history of the idea of race in Mexico. It's not about racism, although you can definitely use it to interrogate racism. It's not about the races. The book starts from the premise that race is a story. Race is a story with material effects. Race isn't as easily as we think ascribed to clearly identifiable groups of people. So it's not about the races. That's a project for anthropologists. It's not about racism. That's a political project which I'm interested in my own life, but wasn't the basis for the book. The book is about the idea of race, the building block stuff that makes these other more material, immediate things thinkable. So it's sort of, in some ways, the book is sort of a work of philosophy, but it's a work of philosophy that runs through actual history of the country known as Mexico for about 150 years of history, and specifically how literary writers dealt with race during its formation as an idea, and during different moments of intensity where the question of race was very much on people's mind in Mexico. Take 1925, for example. There's this guy, not impossible that a couple of you guys have at least heard of him. There's this guy named Jose Vasconcelos. Jose Vasconcelos writes a book called The Cosmic Race. The book called The Cosmic Race ends up much later. We don't have to worry about like the specific history of it and stuff like that in this context. It's all the history of that book is complicated in its own right. But he writes this book called The Cosmic Race at a time, 1925, when if you know the Mexican history, the Mexican Revolution has happened, but it is still sort of happening, and everything is still sort of up in the air. Because the Mexican Revolution is a revolution. So sure, it starts in 1910, but then you got to pick up the pieces for like 3 or 4 decades afterwards. So it's 1925, the revolution has happened, stuff is definitely going on. Those famous murals, you know, from like Diego Rivera and stuff like that, those are going up. Mexico City is a really cool place. But there's a general sort of, how should I put it? There's a question in the air that's been in the air since a good 75 years before 1925, which is sort of like, Mexico, it's like this great, beautiful place with all this potential, but its people are all mixed up. You've got people that are sort of like you've got projects that are on the leading edge of modernity that we should compare to places like New York City and Paris. But then you have indigenous communities, some of which don't speak Spanish. How do we make this into a coherent country that makes sense, that's on a project, that's going somewhere, and that is coherent in a way where we can actually perceive development happening? These kind of questions have been in the air from philosophers for a long time before this. And a lot of dudes started thinking about this in terms of the relationship between countries, right, or nation states, and race. And one of the leading theories for a long time was that a nation should have a race. There should be some sort of coherent resonance between nations and races. So what is France? Well, France is where French people live. Who are French people? Well, French people are the people of the French race. It doesn't matter if it's not intellectually sophisticated. A bunch of intellectually sophisticated guys were working this out systematically. And in the American republics, from the United States to Argentina, stressing people out. It was stressing people out because the populations of the American countries are racially mixed up. And you had these important thinkers from the centers of the center of the global economy, which means that the stuff that you say, even if it's absurd, carries weight. You had these important thinkers, they had journals where they were writing about this stuff, and journals dedicated to this stuff, the problem of race. And so there was this theory out there that countries that were racially mixed up were always on the verge of becoming degenerate. Like the race wouldn't be able to develop. And so this was stressing people, this was stressing civic leaders and political thinkers, stressing them out in the Americas. So this Vasconcelos guy comes along in 1925, and the Mexican elite, digamos. Do people speak Spanish? Does anybody not speak Spanish? You don't speak Spanish? Thank you for just getting right there with it. It's like see this guy. We should all move up here. Okay. If I do any Spanish, it'll be Spanglish for you. De nada. See? So it's stressing people out, and this whole question of like the fate of Mexico and how is Mexico going to develop? We're all mixed up, and et cetera, et cetera. And essentially, what Vasconcelos does is he goes, "Hey, check it out. Mexican mixedness, which is called mestizaje. There's no sign of degeneracy in that. simply the process pushing us to the future. And Mexico represents this space of a kind of a cosmic laboratory even, where all the races are mixing, and out of this laboratory is going to come sort of like the great mixed race. So Mexico isn't behind the times. It's not slow. It's not in the process of sinking into the morass of what they call degeneracy at the time. It's actually the future. It's actually pointing a way to the future. It is, in effect, cosmic. So this book often gets cited, and even today still gets cited, as this great sort of like anti-racist book and this great sort of celebration of the mixing of the peoples, almost like a kind of multiculturalist homage or something like that. But most people don't read the actual book. If you read the book, you realize what Vasconcelos is actually saying, and when I say this, it's not like a big act of interpretation. What is Vasconcelos really saying? He's just saying it. It's just in the book. He's saying that, well, what this is about is like, you know, the races that haven't contributed as much and stuff, they're just going to sort of fade out in this process of mixedness, of mestizaje. And then specifically in the case of Mexico, his big preoccupation, and it's a perennial preoccupation for Mexican intellectuals for for a good century. His preoccupation is the fact that a huge part of the Mexican population are indigenous communities, and the indigenous communities aren't rushing full force into the great promises of urban modernization. They have cultures, communities, lives, loves that they're cool with. They're not rushing, and on top of that, they've had several centuries of colonial violence enacted upon them, so they're not super trustful of these plans. So Vasconcelos' idea of like, yeah, check it out, we're the future and we're the place where everybody mixes, is quite explicitly a way of saying, and yeah, through this, the indigenous communities will just kind of fade away, right? They'll definitely contribute to the project of Mexican identity. They'll be a big part of it. Vasconcelos doesn't say this, but other thinkers that say similar things. Gamio, the guy I was going to talk about today, says a similar thing in a more sophisticated scientific language. They'll even become the soul of Mexico. Because through indigenous culture, we get all these great, specifically Mexican symbols, right? And signs, and a kind of a creative force. But ultimately, the whole project of the cosmicness of the cosmic race of Vasconcelos, the end product of mestizaje, is that it will paper over this long history, this long civil war that never quite ends between urban modernization and non-urban indigenous cultures. I actually don't deal with Vasconcelos that much in the Mestizo state, but I wanted to bring it up and start with it because it's such a signature thing. If you tell people like, oh yeah, I've been working on Mexico and I've worked on race and the whole mestizaje question, people almost immediately go, yeah, like Vasconcelos, like that's the thing that people know. So why that moment of intensity in 1925? Well, it's like smack in the middle decade of post-revolutionary reimagination of what is the nation. And that was one guy's answer to it, one guy's answer that was sort of symptomatic, let's say, of larger conversations that were going on then and had been going on as the revolution broke out, and then were going on just before the revolution, and then were going on in the 19th century, and that have been going on since Vasconcelos. That dynamic when I read, see, I sort of got into that in a book before the Mestizo state. I wrote a book about multiculturalism in Latin America. And that dynamic of reading Vasconcelos, especially after hearing what Vasconcelos is sort of the great, kind of champion of multiculturalism, and then actually reading it and being like, wait, what? Like that process got me thinking, like, I don't know if we've thoroughly studied the evolution of the history of the idea of race in Mexico. So I kind of got into the project through these little clues from an earlier project. I also got into it through stuff from real life, just stuff that was just interesting to me. I have a long relationship. I'm not Mexican, but I have a long relationship with Mexico. I've been going to Mexico a lot since I was a little kid. And before I was in academia, I spent a lot of time in Mexico. I walked Mexico from north to south. One thing that has always sort of interested me, sort of caught my attention about Mexico, is a certain kind of expression of racial otherness vis-a-vis the United States. And by racial otherness, I mean, I'm talking about a popular expression, a thing that just like people say. And racial distinction vis-a-vis the United States. And one thing that you'll hear in Mexico, and when I say here in Mexico, I mean, you'll hear in Mexico today. I was in Mexico City last spring, I heard it, just talking to somebody. Racismo, sí, no, México no hay racismo, no es un país racista. Racismo, ese es del norte, this is de Estados Unidos. Racism is something that happens in the United States, not in Mexico. Now, of course, I'm not saying that like Mexican people aren't conscious of racism. There's a current president in Mexico that has put racism into the public realm, into the public discussion. But there is this sort of like immediate reaction that no, racism is about the United States, and in Mexico, it's, people are mixed up, so how can there really be racism? And one of the fascinating things is I've had that conversation so many times in my life, and the person that says that will so commonly, within minutes after saying that, say something to the effect of, in Mexico, it's like the indigenous people, it's just a problem. Right? Which is, it's just like bland racism. It's the blandly racist comment, right? It's not even interesting. But that sort of friction, that interests me. Because that essentially tells you, if you're a scholar, like I am, that tells you that, like, okay, like, race, the idea works differently here. I've never been interested in, I've never been like even mildly tempted by the notion of like, oh, which society or which space is more racist than the other. Race isn't a quantity. Racism, you can't weigh it. It's not about more and less. It's about Western countries in their modern form, which is the nation state, formed at a moment when race was the dominant mode of organizing people. So race is at stake. Pick your country, and let's just keep it to the Americas. We don't have to, but let's just pick your country, and race is at stake. It's a question of how it works and what's its history. So I was interested in that about Mexico. And then my area is literature, so I read a lot. Read a lot of novels, stories. And then I started, with this sort of in mind, I just started noticing that, wow, if you take like the Mexican literary canon and like read the great works of the canon from the early 19th century until now, frankly, but we're talking about canonicity, so let's talk about old stuff. So let's say up until 92, so almost 200 years of literature. It is really hard to name a book where like race doesn't show up as a key problematic in the book at some point. Some books like that, some of the classics, like that's what they're about. And you might even not know that's what it's about until you start thinking about it. You're like, oh, that's what it's about. So I was interested in that, and it seemed to me that these really interesting literary producers would be sort of a nice laboratory to sort of explore how race works in the context of Mexico. So 101, just like basic starting point, back to that conflict, that weird seeming contradiction, which, you know, as I study this more and more, it became less and less of a contradiction of running into a Mexican person and saying, no, racism, that's a thing in the United States. I mean, there's a certain logic to it because the way the race works is so different. Race, the idea of race in the United States, is governed very explicitly by segregation. That's how the idea of race has unfolded in the United States, both in its theorization and in its material effects. Right? The United States is a country founded on racialized slavery, a couple centuries of it. And that sort of established its own logic of this vast legal apparatus that ended up filling American society with one-drop rules and redlinings, and essentially like who can stand where on what terms, both formally, legally, and informally. The logic of race in the United States is segregation. The logic of race in Mexico, which we've been talking about, which my colleague mentioned very eloquently in the Mexican-American experience. The logic of race in Mexico is sort of the opposite of that, right? It's this idea of mestizaje, which is at the very center of Mexican identity, also for historical reasons. Because of the patterns of the relationship between Europeans that showed up, invaded, and conquered that space versus North America, that history is quite different. And the legal structure of organizing people in that space turned out to almost have the opposite historical experience from the United States. Some of you might have heard of, like, there's this old Spanish imperial system of the castas, where people are like organized into groups and certain rights, right, based on their mixture of blood. The Spanish sort of obsession with pureza de sangre. Just due to all kinds of historical factors, I mean, that stuff just like broke down completely, just because of the infinite mixtures of people from discrete groups, forming new communities, mixed communities, some more, some mixed, some not, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got this sort of North American dominant idea of race based on segregation, and then you have this and Mexico here is representative of many, in fact, you can say most Latin American countries, where of this idea of mixture. That's basic. There's very little for somebody that's like a critical theorist like I am, there's nothing super interesting in demonstrating that again and again. What I personally think is interesting, or when that stuff gets interesting, is when you take those ideological truths and you disobey them. And this isn't to say that that stuff isn't true, right? Or that it's not significant and not worth reflection. Is to say that maybe a lot of that stuff is based on the kind of truth that becomes repeated so much that it's hard to see anything else. And what might be more interesting and also more crucial for all of us as critical citizens in the world who are interested in upsetting racism, it might be more interesting to think about how do these truths around race undo themselves and collapse. That's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. So in the North American context, how does this sort of ideology of segregation become completely frazzled over and over again by this incessant mixture that just roils about underneath all the norms and laws and formalities around segregation. Like segregation may be a way of thinking about segregation critically. is to think about it as a desperate attempt, right, to, I don't know what, like stop water or air or something like that. Because people mix. That's just what they do. Mestizaje. Mestizaje is the great sort of metaphor for communities mixing their blood and mixing their practices and mixing their cultures and stuff like that. In what ways does that story prohibit us from seeing the constant acts of segregation that exist within a context, right? Overexpressed through mestizaje. Those are the kind of questions that I'm interested in. And one of the things that was cool about writing the book, The Mestizo State, and getting back to some of these classic works of literature, and some of these works of literature, they sound like it's like hard stuff. This is the kind of stuff that you can't put it down. You can't turn off the light at night, like that kind of stuff. One of the things that was interesting in working through these classic literary texts is like, you know, the most sort of creative and critical thinkers of Mexican cultural history as writers. I mean, they see that and they put it into their stories. That ends up becoming a theme. That ends up becoming sort of embedded into these stories. The way in which mestizaje keeps, like, in spite of itself, slipping back into segregation. Because if somebody's like, you know, what is race? Well, race is about separating people into groups. Right? Race always, I mean, that's the thing. That's the tragedy of race. That's the tragedy of living in societies that are founded on ideas of race, is that you just can never quite get, no matter how you want to spin it and think about it and how multiculturalist you want to get, once you're in the world of race, it always somehow returns to segregation. So that's what the Mestizo State is about. It's about how does the story of mestizaje consistently undo itself. And the major front line for this question, and it's definitely not the only line, but the major front line is the way in which the history of thinking about race in Mexico as mestizaje, again and again, becomes a way ultimately of talking about what does modern Mexico, sorry, that's a bad way to put it. What does modernizing Mexico, quote unquote, do about the indigenous communities? It becomes the question that never leaves the scene, and ultimately you're getting all of this really sort of abstract high theory about like how culture, like theory of culture, theory of race, theory of nation, and all this stuff, and then ultimately at some point these stories keep coming back to what people called in the 19th century and kept calling it all the way up until the middle of the 20th century, el problema indígena, which is a borderline offensive way, the indigenous problem, which is a borderline offensive way of saying, or how do kids talk these days? Low-key offensive. It's like a low-key offensive way of essentially saying that the problem of the indigenous communities, the indigenous problem, is the indigenous community's own commitment to the way they live. Like that becomes the problem. That's what people mean, and the fact that there's a 5th-century history of indigenous communities flourishing in resistance, right, to the plans to the plans of, let's just call them modernizers of all stripes. It's a little problematic to talk like this because I've dealt with this in another book too. This idea that there's this sort of dynamic between modernity and tradition, and the indigenous live in the world of tradition and stuff like that. But of course, that's just a story too, right? Modernity and modernization in Mexico is, with the participation of indigenous communities as well. But so that's what the Mestizo State is about. It's about that dynamic. It's about the dynamic and the history of the dynamic, and the ways in which, through all of its complexities, the idea of race sort of constantly undoes itself and then sort of snaps back into place in these different stories that always end up in some sort of assertion of some sort of logic of segregation, let's call it. So I could have read some stuff here, and I still could, but how long have I been talking? Has visto la 25 minutos? If I would have read, I would have talked to you guys about a lot of the stuff I did already. I would have told you the story of this little dude in 1910. I don't actually know if he was little. It's just in my mind's eye, he's a little dude. He seems like it. Like when I find these documents and stuff, he seems like a little dude running around. But he's actually kind of cut an important figure. This is 1910. This is the final days of what's called the Porfiriato. Do you know what the Porfiriato means if I say that? ¿Qué tan mexicanista es ese público? I don't know if people are. Raise your hand if you know what the Porfiriato is, for real. Okay, you too. Okay, well, good. Thank you. See, that's helpful to know that. So when people say the Porfiriato, they're talking about a dictatorship that ruled Mexico for 30 years and that ended in 1910. It's the state, it's the governmental structure, right? It's the regime that the Mexican Revolution overthrew. So this little dude is running around in 1910, and he's like, hey, people are writing a lot of sociological works and essays that are appearing here and there and stuff like that about el problema indígena, but maybe we could have an institute for that problem. We'll call it the Sociedad Indianista. We'll call it the Indianist Society. And it'll be really cool, and there we'll study indigenous peoples and we'll figure out trajectories for development. And this guy himself is pretty interesting. I mean, he's this little dude is he's like the chief magistrate of the Supreme Court, and he's like one of those guys from that time. It's like he's chief magistrate of the Supreme Court, and on the side he's a philologist. You know what a philologist is? It's like an old-fashioned name for somebody that studies languages. So he studies indigenous languages. And he's like, yeah, let's do a Sociedad Indianista. I don't remember the details of how he drummed up both the resources and the political will, but they established it, and it's a big deal. They have a big 3-day opening Congress. El Porfiriato is from Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz himself shows up for the opening ceremonies. They've got music. They're playing Beethoven for some reason. Lots of food, lots of speeches, homages to indigenous soldiers, all kinds of stuff like that. Guys stand up. People often think oh yeah, today it's we're so cool and we're so critical and cool on the idea of race. People have been cool and critical on the idea of race for a long time. Guys stand up in 1910 and they denounce white supremacy, and that's not me imposing the language of today on that. They actually literally denounce white supremacy. And one dude even points to Porfirio Diaz himself, kind of a badass thing to do. Actually points to the president and who's all powdered, because Porfirio Diaz was always wanted to look, really like a European general. Points him out and says, "Look at this guy. Look at his Mestizo blood," because Porfirio Diaz was Mestizo. His family was part Mixteco. And all this happens, and there's all this stuff, and the Congress ends up, and there's lots of good vibes and promises to do more stuff, just like any academic conference. Before you never hear from each other again, and lots of good vibes and stuff, and even a month later, there's a newspaper article that's hey, the Sociedad Indianista is already producing stuff, and it's some huge landowner is yeah, I'm gonna do a literacy program for my indigenous employees or something like that. I think it's a little headline in the newspaper. Guys, this is freaking 1910, man. It's November 1910. It might be 112. It could be to the day. I don't remember the date. This is 1910, end of the year 1910. So this headline, I have the newspaper. This headline you know, the Sociedad Indianista is producing stuff. Now it's sharing headlines with explosions in Oaxaca, you know, fighting in Chihuahua. Quintana Roo is out of control. This is the first moments of the Mexican Revolution. So Porfirio Diaz is all like, yeah, he's going to get behind the Sociedad Indianista, and like literally 3 months later, the dude's on a boat to France. And I don't know why, but to me, there's just something beautifully poetic about that. That when like the state like finally gets to this place of like, yeah, we're gonna like really get serious about el problema indígena. No, campesinos all around Mexico say, you know what, we'll just do the job for you. And they show up, and the state completely collapses. It's the Mexican Revolution. So had I read this as a formal talk, I would have told you about that story. I would have told you about the ways in which, like, the story of Mexico's political history itself is so embedded in race. Mestizaje is the mixture of peoples. It points back to La Conquista itself. Cortés and La Malinche and like the birth of the first Mestizo and all this big mythical language and stuff like that. There's no like clean trajectory from like Cortés in 1523 and the Spanish invasion of mainland Mexico. And then centuries of production of births of mixed race peoples of all kinds of mixes. There's not like some clear like conscious notion from that moment all the way up until like I don't know what, 1968 or something like that. That whole history, nobody's interested in that history until the 19th century. When Mexico as a nation state starts, its state, you know, philosophers and stuff start asking like, well, what is Mexico? What's our history? What's our identity? That's when all that stuff gets recuperated. Lots of moments that we can mark to say, you know, like when was it exactly that interest in that sort of identity formation got hot. One fun one to pick might be 1867. It's called the Restored Republic. The French had sent some Austrian dude to rule over Mexico for a while, and something that sounds like it's out of today's newspaper had to do with like debts. And so there was like a French occupation of Mexico, and then the Mexican resistance had to overthrow that. And the person that becomes the sort of the hero of there were many heroes of that, the sort of the outstanding hero that was the president that was overthrown and then comes back triumphantly, is this guy named Benito Juarez. Have you guys heard of Juarez? Does that ring a bell? Benito Juarez? A little bit, couple guys like, yeah, maybe. Benito Juarez would be like, if it was like the US context, it would be like Abraham Lincoln, not because he did the same kind of things, but like somebody of that size. Right? Like he's the guy that if you go to Chicago, there's like a statue to Juarez, and if you go to Paris, there's another statue for Juarez. He's like an important guy. And one of the things that no Mexican historian can miss the opportunity to mention immediately when you mention Juarez is that he's de pura raza. You'll see that expression a lot. De pura raza, of pure race. Because he was an indigenous guy. He was Zapotec. He was Western, completely Western in his dress, in his outlook, classical liberal, super into the privatization of lands, stuff like that. He was not any kind of an Indianista or indigenista, but he was an indigenous guy. And that then becomes part of the story, right? The story of the foundation of an authentic Mexico, right? Rests on a president that can be pointed out as the indigenous president. I might have told you that story. And then back to Porfirio Diaz, as I already mentioned, right? Porfirio Diaz is sort of the next, there's other people, but he's sort of the next memorable president, or the next memorable sort of political force that transforms Mexico. And the Diaz regime really did transform Mexico. And he's a mestizo guy, like explicitly mestizo. Previous presidents have been largely white. And then statesmen start trying to think about like, okay, so how does Mexico work? And again, they turn to race. Like, why is the Porfiriato so effective? Because I mean, the 19th century had been like all civil wars, one after another, and then Porfirio Diaz is able to sort of like, right, like really like clamp things down and not get overthrown, essentially, and not get overthrown for 30 years. How does that work? And some of the most sophisticated thinkers at the time, they say, well, it's the mestizaje. Because mestizaje is a balancing of antagonisms, right? It's you take two in conflict, and then you have one. And it's nacional, popular. And so they start pointing to him. So again, I mean, it comes up again and again and again. All these explanations of how Mexico works with metaphors of race. So that's the kind of stuff that I work with in El Estado Mestizo. And if this was a different kind of talk, we might walk through some of that stuff piece by piece, but step by step. But why do that? And then, after Diaz, and we can stop and we can open up for questions, interesting questions too, about like what's going on today and stuff. After Diaz, then comes the revolution, and I told you the story of Jose Vasconcelos, but there's people that are more interesting and frankly more significant than Vasconcelos around the revolution, people whose stuff is really going to last. You guys don't know Vasconcelos, but you know Diego Rivera. I'm going to guess some of you have heard of Diego Rivera. And all the great artists that do this sort of art that has allegorical narrative content to it, right? And so much of that has to do precisely with the racialized drama of the formation of Mexico. Oppressed indigenous communities, overcoming their oppression, the sort of formation of the Mestizo states, all like placed out in some of the most beautiful art in the 20th century for everybody to see and learn from. These are big ideological projects that are saturated in this stuff. And with this, I'll end. If this is stuff you're interested in, you want to learn more about it, one person to really keep your eye on is the guy who's largely understood as sort of the foundational figure of Mexican anthropology, a guy by the name of Manuel Gamio. Manuel Gamio, an anthropologist, so if you guys can like imagine anthropology, the idea is like you go out and study people, and then you report back. You go somewhere, you see how people live, how they act, how they construct meaning, you take lots of notes. I mean, this is stereotypical anthropology, but this is just like classic anthropology, right? And then you bring it back. Well, Gamio is like interesting because he's like, okay, I'm an anthropologist, but I'm not going to go to, I'm not going to go to the other side of the world and find a culture that I don't really like, know anything about, but that can be really interesting in its exoticism. And then bring that information back and we can learn from it. He's like, no, I'm just going to go like 10 feet this way and study and work with the indigenous communities. And his motivation for doing that, or a big part of his project, like the central part of his project, was again to ask that question. How is Mexico going to realize its coherence as Mexico, i.e., what can Mexico, meaning modernizing, centralized, urban Mexico, do with and about the indigenous communities? So mestizaje becomes a way, even with the most sophisticated thinkers and stuff, it still becomes a way of euphemizing the civil war that never quite settles between one set of social, cultural, economic ideals against another. Let's stop there, see if anybody wants to talk about anything. Sound good?
Yes. So before I take questions, I want to encourage you to think about, I'd like you, that you have the capability to ask a question that is relevant to your major or your way of life. So the art, in this case literature, and you mentioned Diego Rivera, but literature allows you to decide as you're reading something that you're really interested in that's caught your attention, whether it's Harry Potter, whether it's Los de Abajo, one of the most important books out of the Mexican Revolutionary period. You're reading something of interest, there's something there that's caught your interest because it's something familiar to you, whatever that is. And so that's why great literature transcends time. Mestizaje, evolution, transcends time. So let me just give you some background. The Porfiriato is the equivalent to the American Gilded Age, whereas the Porfiriato creates some political stability, there's some urbanization taking place, and the Mexican economy is formally connected to the American economy, to the global economy. You can think of Mark Twain writing about the Gilded Age. The Mexican Revolution is a pivotal moment in Mexican history But you compare the Mexican Revolution to the American Civil War, but much more complicated. It's not just regional. So to give you some context to what Professor Lund is discussing and enlightening us about. But literature, what is your, whether you personally, the idea, those of us of Mexican or Latino heritage, Hispanic heritage, or Spanish heritage, or something even depending on what your major is, something you're curious about. Because that's the great thing about art and the great thing about literature. There's something there for everyone. And in this case, I'm asking you to have the courage to ask a question, to find out a little bit more about what Professor Lund's been discussing. Because the United States, in a lot of ways, this idea of a nation of immigrants, which is debatable, is immigration is the mestizaje process, the rejuvenation of the people and the ideas. That's just one aspect of it. So we all descend, we're all descendant of immigrants within 2 or 3 generations, 4 generations. So you're part of this mestizaje process in the United States. To oversimplify that, right?
Why not?
So, but does anyone have any questions, Professor Lund, to learn a little bit more about what's going on with it? Yes, sir.
Sí, por favor, por favor.
El mestizaje empezó cuando los españoles llegaron y Hernán Cortés con su hijo Martín, o fue después cuando se dice de que fue el mestizaje después de ahorita que estamos hablando del porfiriato, fue en ese entonces, a mí lo que quiero decir es de que si fue en ese entonces o fue después cuando se...
Sí. ¿Contesto? Estás preguntando, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Sí. Muy, muy buena pregunta. Y hay una forma muy sencilla, muy directa de contestarla, ¿no? Y luego después una un poco más complicada. Sí, ¿no? Digamos Martín, ¿no? Martín es como parte de la gran mitología. Mitología no quiere decir no, ¿verdad? Quiere decir que alguna historia convertido en algo más grande que yo mismo, ¿no? Y esa figura, la noción de que Cortés es el conquistador de México, estaba con, ¿no?, la Malinche, Malintzin, ¿no? Tenía un hijo, ese es el primer mestizo, ¿no? Y hay otras historias, otras narrativas y contranarrativas del primer mestizo, algo así. Primer mestizo, ¿por qué? Porque ya habían, depende de cómo quieres definir mestizo, ¿no? Había muchos mestizos indígenas, ¿verdad? Porque los indígenas no eran así como un grupo homogéneo, ¿no? Pero no tenían conciencia de raza, no tenían idea de raza, porque eso no era una idea europea. Entonces, si vamos a decir que el primer mestizo viene con esta invasión de los españoles a México, ¿no? Y los primeros partos de bebés, parte español, parte indígena, sí, el mestizaje empezó allí y nunca paró, ¿no? Nunca paró. Los españoles llegaron invadiendo quizás con sueños de volver, pero generalmente venían para quedarse, ¿no? A quedarse, ¿no? Y venían mayormente hombres, ¿no? Entonces ese proceso de combinar, ¿no?, sangre y culturas empezó en ese momento traumático de conquista y nunca paró, ¿no? Nunca. Entonces, en cuanto al mestizaje literal, lo que estás mencionando, sí, es un proceso continuo que empieza con la llegada de europeos a las Américas, de norte a sur, ¿no? Entonces, literal, sí. Ahora, la otra parte de la pregunta y un poco lo que a mí me interesa más en el estado mestizo, porque la colonia es como una cosa muy complicada y hay especialistas que trabajan en eso. Y cada vez que abro la boca intentando decir algo sobre la época colonial, yo digo alguna bobada, equivocación. Y mi colega aquí, el colonista, dice, bueno, no, de hecho, bla, bla, digo, okay, perdón. Pero en términos generales sí empieza y no para, ¿no? Porque la gente se reproduce, ¿no? Ahora, lo que es más interés de mi libro, El Estado Mestizo, este proceso entendido como la gran historia del mestizaje que termina con la identidad nacional de México. Sí, esta es una historia que empieza a confabular y contar y pensar en, digamos, el siglo XIX, ¿no? Y fechas exactas, puedes decir, bueno, ese escritor en los 1830 ya estaba hablando de eso y todo eso. Para mí, en mis investigaciones, me parece que esa historia se convierte en una especie de ideología, algo que la gente en general empieza a pensar, es más producto de los 1850, 60, 70, por ahí, ¿no? Es decir, que hay una historia real ahí que a nadie le importa por siglos, ¿no? Y llegamos a un momento donde esa historia está recuperada, ¿no? Como lo que se llama en teorías de la nación, ¿no? La invención, ¿no? Del pasado, ¿no? La historia de dónde venimos, ¿no? Cada nación tiene esa historia, ¿no? Que está llena de mitología y cosas que son muy fáciles de falsificar y todo eso. Pero eso no quiere decir que la historia no es importante, ¿no? Lleva peso, ¿no? Entonces, ¿contesto la pregunta? ¿Eso es lo que estabas pensando? Sí.
So the question was, when does this
Oh yeah, this is
process
good. Yeah, you do that.
when does this the evolution of the Mexican people?
Pero creo que todo el mundo habla español, ¿no? ¿Todo el mundo habla español? We'll have coffee after and I'll tell you everything that happened.
So the question was, when does this process, essentially the birth and nacimiento de la gente mexicana, de raza mestizo, cuando nace? So when do the Mexican people, when are they born? When does the issue, the evolution of what is Mexican begin?
Well, but it was more when does mestizo begin?
When's the process begin?
Yeah. And that would go really good with my talk because, you know, it's like mestizo is Mexican, right? You know what I mean? It's like that whole game. Anyway, go on.
And so, Hernán Cortés, who was the general, the Spanish general, the conquistadores, he has a relationship with Doña Marina, who was a slave woman, who in Mexican cultures and literature she's blamed for all that went wrong for the indigenous people. When in actuality, she spoke 3 languages, she was incredibly intelligent, and she was forced upon different men. So she was not only a survivor, but she was, without her, the whole process, the mestizaje process, could have begun. Mm-hmm. She's a lot like Pocahontas when she marries John Smith. But the idea is Pocahontas, forget her name, she completely abandons her identity, and she completely commits to, in her marriage, to becoming a European. And there's famous pictures of her dressed like that. And there's a Disney movie about her. So Hernán Cortés and Doña Marina, La Malinche, and La Malinche in Mexican culture is a whore. So she's the horrible misogyny within Mexican culture and Latin American culture, but I think Mexico's at the top of it, unfortunately. But there's the process of when does the United States begin? So begin in 1607 with Jamestown, and then there you're going to have Pocahontas and John Smith and their children. But the difference is that the relationships between Europeans and indigenous people is very minor and marginalized, and the indigenous woman has completely abandoned herself. There's too many indigenous peoples in Mexico, maybe 15 million in the Spanish arrival. So they can't hide what they're embarrassed about the European society. So the process begins, but it's more marginalized in the United States, because the Mexican peoples in Mexico in 1600 is a much larger population.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing super important, muchas gracias por la pregunta, que la pregunta implica yo hablo español. Y es precisamente esa noción de cuándo empieza, cómo construir la historia de los orígenes de una población, un pueblo, ¿no? Una nación. Y claro que eso de John Smith y Pocahontas es una historia. Otra historia es de Mayflower. Otra historia es Ellis Island y la nación de inmigrantes, ¿no? ¿Dónde exactamente comienza Estados Unidos, ¿no? De hoy? Y precisamente ustedes saben de cambio al inglés. Are you guys aware of the 1619 project? You know what that is? It's created a lot of controversy and stuff. So the 1619 project is is just an absolutely fascinating sort of revisionist, kind of journalistic, but still historic, serious history, but journalistic. It's for the people. It's a revisionist project about American history, and it's called 1619 because that's when the first enslaved Africans showed up in a North American port. Right? So that's another origin story, right? Is the United States of America thinkable without slavery? Does the United States of America, in terms of its sort of like deep historical unconscious, does it not start, the 1619 authors ask, does it not start when slavery makes its appearance? Chattel slavery of Africans kidnapped and brought to the Americas. Would that not be the more proper origin to think about the Americas? Right? That's a controversial thing to say, right? But that's essentially a way of saying that we make these origin stories. 1776 or 1619, right? That's what this text is asking. And so back to Mexico and mestizaje and race, that's interesting that in the 19th century, I mean, the sort of strength of the discourse of the ideology of mestizaje in Mexico shows up in the 19th century when Mexican statesmen are stressed about what does Mexico even mean, can we even keep this thing together, and precisely at that time, the way that Western philosophers are thinking about nation is precisely through race. So it's that sort of mix of elements that gets people saying like, oh yeah, okay, right? The mestizo, and so we can trace, podemos trazar nuestra historia a ese momento traumático, no? And then just for literary references and stuff like that, if any of you guys just want to get your minds blown, I mean, there's that super famous text. There's no more famous text on Mexican identity, but right smack in the middle of the century, 1950, Octavio Paz. It's called The Labyrinth of Solitude. And in just such an incredibly, just crazy but fascinating way, he kind of breaks down the dynamic that we were talking about Cortez, Malitzin, and the trauma of the origin. And it's all wrong. Everything that Paz says is like wrong. But it's like reading Freud, I mean, it's like it's wrong, but you still once you start, you're like, wow, it's like all wrong, but you can't help yourself. I highly recommend that work if you want to get into not the material reality of Mexican life by any means, but if you want to get into sort of a moment of intensity of how extremely talented thinkers and writers think about that process. Check out El Laberinto de la Soledad, The Labyrinth of Solitude. But no, it's one of those things like read with caution. No going in that it's crazy. Yeah.
So going back to the previous point you made, I mean, in Mexico, maybe not so much in percentage, but there, in absolute terms, there are a lot of people of African heritage.
100%.
How do they fit in?
That's a great question, and I have to do that thing you have to do in academic books where you kind of like say like, yeah, I know about this, I know it exists, I know it's a problem, and then you go like that, and you kind of say like, well, I'm not really going to talk about that. And I'm not, because the book, it's a thin book, it's a contemplative book, it's not an exhaustive book, it's not a history of the races in Mexico. But since you bring it up, well worth mentioning, there are important Afro-descendant populations in Mexico on both the east and west coast, especially, other places too, but especially. And that, I mean, in some ways my book is symptomatic of it. There's just not a ton of material to work with, in terms of like my sort of, my literature as a laboratory and stuff, because that dimension of the heterogeneity of the races in Mexico, the Afro-descendant dimension, has been so systematically and thoroughly erased from Mexican identity. And of course, there's been an important reaction against that, dating all the way back to, I think it was like the 60s when Aguirre Beltran wrote his big book on Afro-descendant peoples in Mexico and stuff. But it still always has to sort of fight for space in the discussions around the history of race in Mexico. But I know that scholars like much more agile than me have been writing more and more super interesting stuff about those corners of Mexico and the history of Afro-descendant peoples in the Mexican experience. That's for sure. I mean, that is for sure happening.
So Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829. Yeah, 1829. During the presidency of someone who was more likely of Afro descent. Vicente Guerrero.
Yeah.
Who
Guerrero
he passes and contributing to the Texas Revolution, the Texas revolt, we'll call it from a Mexican point of view. And by the way, he's the only president that was actually assassinated prior to 18. Oh, he's the only president to be assassinated during the 19th century. Happens to be the Afro-Mexican president. But he would not have identified as a mulatto or as Afro.
No. Right. And that's the thing. Yeah, it's not. There's not a strong there's not a strong ideological current in Mexican sort of popular historical consciousness of like the great Afro-descendant. You know what I mean? President. Or that would be something that like a professor would know, and like alternative histories, revisionist histories would play out. But that's not a main current of the story. In Mexico, which is, that's again, if there's any future researchers out there, this is all a lot of important material for further research. There's infinite complexities involved.
But we should end with a question from a student, and by whoever asks a question, you get dibs on the cookies back there. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'll do it at the end. Sí, ¿no te parece que lo hago al final? No, porque en el medio me parece raro.
No, any questions about where you came from? We'll answer it. We'll take it.
No, I'm not getting into that. That is one thing I will not do.
Not a student. My background is English. My degrees are in English, so this is all kind of new to me, and I'm not even sure I know enough to articulate a question. But,
No, you do.
I mean, I certainly couldn't help but think of Derek only came pop up when you were talking. Like these binaries kind of collapsing on themselves.
Yeah.
And hybridity in third terms, the
Sure.
indigenous being in third term, what have you. I also thought this sort of idea of you see what you know, and it seems like a lot of people talking about these indigenous peoples. I mean, they're looking at them all through the lens of what they know.
Sure.
What are they? What can you talk about? What they're getting wrong and what they're missing, and what they should have seen instead.
Wow.
These indigenous people,
Yeah.
so that they can have a more comprehensive understanding of
Right.
what Mexico could be.
Boy, is that
makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I mean, so you've got, in terms of, I'll just answer it in like a really short version, but I can give you my email and we can correspond. That's like a huge question. It comes up a little bit in my book, but you have all kinds of, so of the people that sort of, that really do interesting things with race: literary producers, social scientists, right? At different historical moments in Mexico, from the late 19th century all up till about the 60s is about where I stopped my book. I mean, you've got people that knew the indigenous communities intimately because they grew up in one. You've got people that lived in regions of Mexico where the indigenous population was massive, and that was just like the sea in which they swam. And then you've got writers and intellectual producers and stuff that are in Mexico City and don't get out of, not that, I mean, there's plenty of indigenous people in the city too, but don't have any contact, and they're just essentially like riffing on, what, quote unquote, what policy issues, what needs to happen to get the indigenous peoples up to speed. But to answer it with, it's an impossible thing to answer with any kind of thoroughness, but to answer in the most direct way possible, when you say like, what were they missing? I would say, and not everybody misses this as badly, and not everybody misses it in the same way. And some people maybe even don't miss it. But from my perspective in reading this history, I would say that ultimately what's missed is to fail to start the conversation and start the thought process resisting the notion that the indigenous communities represent a quote-unquote problem. I feel like once you enter it with the idea of it being a problem, you've entered into sort of a hierarchical relationship where race is at stake. Not to say racist, because it's just like, it's not helpful. Just, you've entered into a hierarchical relationship that says, I'm here and I have some sort of authority of institution around me, and I will look at you and diagnose, right? Because as a problem. Now, it would be cool to turn that around and just turn that around and put it on like all academics everywhere all the time, right? Because at some point I had to be like, oh wow, that whole race thing happens in Mexico. That's kind of interesting, right? Which is just a fancy way of saying it's kind of a problem. So you can, you know what I mean? You can turn that around and say that about anybody. So one thing I always try to do, just as a writer, is I always try to bring, even when they're terrible, I try to bring a lot of empathy to the subject that I'm writing about, and understand that like if people aren't writing about what they're writing about in good faith, I'm not going to write about them writing about it. So even the ones, even like the nutso guy Vasconcelos with the Raza Cosmica and stuff, and he's really probably, I mean, he ends up getting in with the Nazis and stuff. I mean, he's really like, he's tough to love, and for me, impossible to love. But when I get into his text, I understand it as like a good faith attempt, right, to deal with something that he perceived and was agitating him. So somebody like the one I would have talked to today, Gamio, what did he get wrong, or like, you know, whatever. I mean, he spent his whole life as an anthropologist living among and working with indigenous communities, like day after day after day. Like going from where, I don't know his biography, but where he like physically lived, but like going to the site that he was working on because it was like right there in Mexico City, and he was definitely like wanted to help. So what he got wrong, I don't know. I would say the first, the mistake, the stumbling is at the first point when you take a cultural group with a whole set of sophisticated mechanisms for dealing with life and the card that they're dealt, and then look at that and say, well, that, you know, that's a problem, and we should figure out how to fix that. That seems to me to be the mistake from the beginning. But in terms of like understanding indigenous communities and like, you know, and indigenous communities are vast. It's extremely heterogeneous in Mexico, right? There's really very, very little. There's essentially nothing you can say like and be correct, like in common. But you know, a lot of the people I write about, I mean, it's not that they didn't get the community or how it worked or whatever. They know a lot. But yeah. The one that was my favorite chapter to write is on this writer named Rosario Castellanos. If you guys like books that gives you nightmares, you should read a book called the Book of Lamentations in English. In Spanish, it's called Oficio de Tinieblas. It's like the great book of deep southern Mexico, which is a place called Chiapas. And Castellanos was interesting because she grew up thinking about race because she was from this sort of aristocratic family in descent, right? They were like losing their social position. They had some indigenous servants, and she's a brilliant woman and ends up just rocketing through, you know, postgraduate education and gets these cool jobs with the state, and then ends up working with like what was a really fascinating generation of anthropologists in Chiapas. Working with Tzotzil communities there, and she's, I mean, she like, check out like her job was like really interesting. They were like trying to teach indigenous communities essentially about Westernization. But again, in good faith, trying to help. This is like the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. And she was a good writer, and her job was she would write scripts for like puppet plays. And then they would bring they would do like puppet plays for like these little indigenous communities, and the whole community would show up and they'd do like puppet plays about things like, you know, everything from like, I don't know what, modern hygiene to racial pride. Like the story of Juarez in puppets, and like she would write that stuff. And so she was, you know, she was heavily involved and heavily committed to this work of like development in the indigenous communities, and she was involved with all these fascinating anthropologists who had lots of cool ideas, and she kind of like threw in the towel and was like, you know what, we're screwed, this is irresolvable. This is like an irresolvable cultural conflict, and then took that frustration and that bitterness and that rancor, and then just plowed it into this novel that is just like, whoa, you know? And she's regularly denounced as racist because she said some tasteless things about indigenous peoples and stuff. Kind of like the way Faulkner, yeah, English, right? She's like the Faulkner of Mexico, not the same, not quite. I mean, there really is only one Faulkner, so she's not like that. But she is a great writer. But in terms of dealing with race, she's like the closest thing, right? The kind of person who's just like hard about the whole question and maybe like a little like racially problematic themselves in their attitudes, but is conscious of those attitudes and realizes it's messed up and it's ethically incorrect, and then puts it into her writing. So what kind of mistake did she make? I don't know. I mean, maybe that also is a mistake, to just like give up. But yeah, that's a great question and tough question.
I mean, it sounds like maybe, you know, a problem with scholarship is that it's kind of built on conversations that come before.
Sure.
So no matter what you do, you have to look at it through the lens of what comes before, and you can only kind of add to the conversation that much in some sense.
Yeah.
So it's hard to have that kind of, you know, the term paradigm shift of thinking.
Yeah.
Because you have to kind of, you know, accrete
Yeah.
on top of what's come before,
Yeah.
rather than just burst into something new.
Yeah.
Because, you know, other people can't relate to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I'm gonna close with a word of thanks. Some people think you should thank at the beginning. I think it's more meaningful at the end. So this was on purpose, is what I'm trying to say. Thank you to the University of Texas Permian Basin. Cool place, cool facilities. This is the first time I've been here. And I just want to say too, I love the kind of radically geological landscape design, like all the big rocks everywhere and stuff that have been positioned in cool ways. Really happy to be here, and really interesting for me. I also want to thank the Odessa Council for the Arts and the Humanities, of course, the Latin American Writers Series, which I'm speaking in right now. I need to thank my main man, Jose Antonio Moreno, buen chiapaneco, ¿no? Aquí en la Basin de Permian. No tengo ni idea cómo decir eso en español. No, pero Professor Moreno invited me here. I don't know if any of you guys are his students or you know him or whatever, but take his classes. Because, like, I mean, these 2 days of, like, hanging out with Professor Moreno, I mean, you would not believe the stories I've gotten. I mean, este tipo sabe contar. And if you take his classes, you will get infected with sort of the significance of the human experience of storytelling. Thanks to you guys for coming. That's it. ¿Tenemos algo más? Bien. Gracias, estimados. Thank you for coming.
Have you gone to the Museum of the Southwest in Midland yet?
I don't think I'm going to have time.
Oh.
I want to today, but then we ate tacos and I got super tired.
Oh, they have.
Can you turn off the microphone? ¿Sabes cómo se hace?
They have like a display of photographs of Frida Kahlo.
Okay.